Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating and frankly sobering piece of military history. You know, there is a massive, often treacherous gap between signing a pristine peace agreement in a quiet room and the messy, chaotic reality of actually implementing it on the ground. We're going to use the Indian peacekeeping force in Sri Lanka as our case study today. It is literally a textbook example of what happens when diplomatic theory violently collides with operational reality.
So it begs a really critical question. Why do peace agreements actually fail during implementation? To figure that out, we're going to examine a mission that was launched with incredibly robust intentions and a super clear framework, only to completely unravel in the crossfire of severe, ground-level friction.
Here's our roadmap. We are going to trace the anatomy of this mission systematically across 6 phases, starting with the initial peace mandate, moving into deployment and early successes, the weapons surrender challenge, the breakdown of trust, the severe operational challenges, and finally, some lasting lessons in peacekeeping.
Okay, Phase 1, the initial peace mandate.
Before a single boot even hit the ground, the Chief of Army Staff issued this strict order of the day. And listen to this. The IPKF's role was explicitly defined as a policing duty to maintain peace with absolute compassion. The rules of engagement demanded total impartiality, protection of the vulnerable, and strictly no involvement in local politics. It was a foundation built on incredibly high moral standards.
On paper, the core pillars of the mission were pristine. Just straightforward, right? Step between the Sri Lankan Armed Forces and the LTTE. Enforce the ceasefire, collect surrendered weapons, dismantle any newly built military camps, and make sure civilians could safely return home. I mean, it's pretty much a textbook peacekeeping checklist.
Moving on to Phase 2, deployment and early successes.
So the 54 Infantry Division begins this massive logistical induction. Just picture the sheer geographic scale of this operation. You've got forces anchoring from the division headquarters in Palali way up north, spreading down through Vavuniya and Trincomalee, and stretching all the way to Batticaloa in the eastern provinces. It's a sprawling, highly complex theater that required intense coordination.
And the plan for implementation? It was a clean, totally logical progression. Step 1, disarm the militants. Step 2, ensure the Sri Lankan Armed Forces pull back to their barracks. Step 3, restore civil administration and set up an interim council. Basically, a step-by-step march straight toward stability.
And you know what? Initially, it actually worked. The IPKF made really tangible strides in civil restoration. They were literally clearing the path for peace by dismantling roadblocks and pulling up landmines, sometimes working right alongside the very guides who had laid those traps in the first place. Airfields were being repaired, large-scale medical aid was flowing in, and banks were reopening. Reassured by the ceasefire, locals actually started coming home.
But then we hit Phase 3, the weapons surrender challenge.
Remember that clean procedural flow we just talked about? Well, it hit an immediate roadblock. Deep security fears and political uncertainty completely paralyzed the weapons handover. LTTE leader V. Prabhakaran outright refused to surrender a single weapon without India's direct insistence, and he demanded a guaranteed, full amnesty for all Tamils first. The hesitation on the ground was absolutely palpable. So, when the surrender ceremony finally does happen in front of the IPKF and Sri Lanka's defense secretary, the actual mechanics of it were super telling. The LTTE surrendered collectively in this highly disciplined, tightly structured manner. But in stark contrast, rival Tamil militant groups just handed their weapons over individually. It seems like a small detail, but this discrepancy completely exposed the deep organizational divides that were brewing right beneath the surface.
Which brings us to Phase 4, the breakdown of trust.
Those divides widened fast. Look at how quickly this unravels. In early August, the LTTE publicly agrees to hand over weapons. Great, right? But by mid-August, they are accusing Indian intelligence of secretly instigating rival groups against them. Following the deaths of some LTTE cadres, their retribution was incredibly swift. By late August, the LTTE had ruthlessly killed over 100 rival militants. The entire foundation of trust just completely collapsed in a matter of weeks.
What emerged was this highly volatile geopolitical trap. It was basically a lethal triangle of deep suspicion between the LTTE, the rival militant factions, and the IPKF itself. In their inability to seamlessly reassure all these different parties, inadvertently sabotaged the exact peace the IPKF was deployed to enforce.
Because of all this sudden bloodshed, we see massive mission creep.
The original mandate was strict, simple peacekeeping, but the escalating violence forced the IPKF into active, heavy-handed law enforcement. The situation deteriorated so severely that they literally had to request heavily equipped anti-riot battalions from the CRPF just to contain the civil unrest.
I mean, the mission expanded so dramatically that entirely separate contingency plans had to be drafted just to protect vulnerable populations. Tamil workers in the Central Highlands plantations were deemed highly defenseless against potential massacres from other armed groups. So the IPKF had to position a para-commando battalion in Polari for rapid emergency airdrops, while the 76th Infantry Brigade was tasked with emergency surface rescues. The sheer complexity of this operation was multiplying by the day.
And that leads right into Phase 5, severe operational challenges. Managing this rapidly expanding crisis was severely crippled by some major systemic failures operating behind the scenes. It was a perfect storm. In terms of command, you had inter-service friction causing inefficient routing and sudden resource withdrawals. Intelligence was practically blind. Infiltration of the LTTE failed, and crucial local police intelligence was completely absent. And logistically, imagine deploying your military into a volatile foreign theater without adequate maps. Troops literally had to navigate relying solely on temporary prints.
Finally, Phase 6, lessons in peacekeeping. Ultimately, dissecting this explainer really drives home a hard truth. An effective peace process absolutely requires an unbreakable four-part formula: a clear mandate, unwavering trust among factions, accurate intelligence, and seamless coordination. If you pull out just one of those pillars, as we clearly saw with the IPKF's intel and logistical blind spots, the whole structure just comes crashing down. So I want to leave you with this final thought. Understanding history helps us prepare for the future, right? We can draw up the perfect mandates, we can print the right maps, and we can draft the most compassionate codes of conduct imaginable. But it always begs the question, when those pristine ideals hit the chaotic, messy reality of ground-level friction, can we ever fully anticipate the human element in conflict? Thanks for exploring this history with me today. Keep asking the hard questions and keep learning.